There was this chap called Marmion, and he met a girl at a tournament, a sort of jousting match, in Lincolnshire. This was in the early 1300s. Well, he fancied her, and he made his love known, and apparently she fancied him too. In fact, she gave him a golden helm to prove it. I hope you're listening to this. But she said, though, that she'd have nothing more to do with him unless he did the most dangerous thing in the kingdom. And Marmion, what a prat! Instead of running a mile, went to see the heralds of arms, who control the rules of these sort of chivalrous tests. And they told him if he wanted to do something really dangerous, he should come to the northeast. Isn't it amazing how nothing changes? Us northeastern chaps stereotyped already. Anyway, he came here to Norham Castle, which at that time was besieged by Robert the Bruce, who just captured Berwick-on-Tweed, a mile or two downstream. And when he got here, his friends told him that if he really wanted to impress the girl, he had to attack the Scots single-handed. So he got his armour on, including, of course, the golden helm. He got his horse out, and he charged single-handed through this gate, which is still called Marmion's Gate. Well, the Scots, of course, beat him to pieces. Who can blame them, the arrogant twit? His friends had to rush out and rescue him. I don't know whether he ever got the girl, probably not if she had any sense. But the point of this heroic tale is to introduce the notion that the northeast was always a harsh place to live, and as a result it's been left with a richer legacy of castles and defensible buildings than any other part of Britain.
Where did they come from, all of these defensible buildings? Why were they needed up here? The answer seems obvious here at Norham Castle, the River Tweed, Scotland, the border. We might think that they were purely and simply to keep out the Scots. But to quote Oscar Wilde, the great Oscar, the truth is rarely pure and never simple. Take the Romans, for example. Now, they were the first people to build proper solid castles in these parts. The Romans arrived in the northeast of what is now England in the year 79 AD, and they built the most extraordinary legacy of defensible buildings. But why were they here? What did they build them for? This is the tombstone of a young Roman cavalry standard bearer called Flavinus, who died in Tynedale about the year 98 AD. It's in Hexham Abbey. He was among the first troops to serve up here in the north. He'd signed up for the army when he was 18 years old, and he was only 25 when he died.
But what was it all for? What was Flavinus actually doing in the northeast in the first place? I bet his mum asked that question often enough. But to be honest, if we're to believe the carving on his tombstone, the answer isn't all that nice, because that suggests that he was here to duff up the locals, to crush the cowering northern barbarians beneath the hooves of his horse. And to do that, to actually get the local population under control, the Romans started off by doing what they always did when they moved into new territory. They built roads and they built forts.
Caerstopitum here, or Corbridge as it's known nowadays, had both. The fort, which is one of the earliest started in the north, was a control post on the great road known as Deer Street, which came up from the south and drove on up north towards Scotland. The modern A68 north into Scotland follows the line of the Roman road now, and like all Roman roads, it oozes confidence as it strides over hills and valleys. It's obvious that the Romans intended to keep on going. Their empire had been expanding continuously for several hundred years, and they clearly didn't intend South Northumberland to be its limit. And yet suddenly they built this, the Roman Wall. The end of the Roman Empire. Why?
Okay, you chaps. Now, I'm sure that you've all heard that your Emperor, Hadrian, has been here on a tour of inspection. And he has decided that what we need is a wall to, now how was it put, to separate the Romans from the barbarians. And he wants you men, you Roman legionaries, to build it for him. Excuse me? What kind of wall? Jolly good question. I think what Hadrian had in mind was something about 15 feet high, possibly about 10 feet wide, and, oh yes, about 70 miles long. That man, come back here immediately. Now, this is what we want you to do. First of all, we want a simple wall. And then, every Roman mile, we'd like a small mile castle on the wall, like so. And between each pair of mile castles, a small turret. A sort of watch turret. Okay? And then, this is the final, rather cunning point, to the north of the wall, a good, deep ditch. About 12 feet deep, which will only be crossable by special causeways opposite each mile castle. Right, does everybody know what to do? Good. Are there any questions? Yes, I've got a question. Why? Why? Yes, why are you building a wall? You've got this far, you're a long way from Rome, you've been expanding your empire for centuries. Why stop here? This is a mile castle. It's called Mile Castle 37 because, now, I hope this isn't too hard for you to understand, because it's number 37 from the eastern end of the wall. It housed about 8 men. These were their barrack blocks. And you can see clearly what its function was. A gateway to the south and one to the north. It was a frontier control post. Look at the quality of the stonework of that archway. Almost all of the archstones or voussoirs are still here, and it's been possible to calculate that this north gate was 13 foot 8 inches high, and it was almost certainly set into a higher tower. It must have looked pretty impressive.
And attached to the mile castle, of course, the wall, which was to have been 10 feet wide, but sometimes isn't. In fact, if you look carefully, you can see where they started to build it wide against the mile castle at the bottom of the picture, but had to taper it off.
Okay, you chaps, now we have a slight change of plan here. The chaps in charge have decided, probably for excellent reasons of economy, that we don't need you to build the wall the full 10 feet. 6 feet wide will be quite sufficient. But we've already built the foundations to the full 10 feet. Jolly good. Jolly good. Carry on. The first few miles at the eastern end of the country were built to the original 10 feet wide specifications. But there's a short section here at Plaintrees which clearly shows the change of plan. 10 feet wide, broad wall foundations with the new narrow wall built on top. This then was the system that the Romans started to build.
It's so famous that there hardly seems any point in showing it to you, but it's so beautiful that it would be cruel not to. Sometimes you wonder if they chose the route for the view. This is the foundation of one of the turrets. Small, square, a couple of centuries perhaps, not much more. The wall is built of beautifully cut sandstone blocks from small quarries, usually just to the south of the wall. These stones are instantly recognisable with their squarish shape. You can see them in hundreds of neighbouring buildings, in field walls, in churches, and especially in the crypt of Hexham Abbey, where the distinctive Roman diamond-shaped tooling on the stones can also be seen. So over the centuries, the wall has shrunk from 16 feet high to its present height. Local people used to snaffle it by the lorry load.
This is Castle 42 at Caulfields. Have you ever seen a dafter place to put a frontier post right on the top of a cliff? You'd think they'd have realised that the north gate here would have been absolutely useless up here, especially when you consider that there's a perfectly usable gap in the cliffs just a few yards south of here. But no, the plan said every mile, and so every mile it had to be. Those Romans loved their plans. They must have been the most disciplined people imaginable.
Right now. Top Brass has decided, in its wisdom, that we need to build forts on the wall, about every 5 miles or so. Now, I do realise that this will involve some of you in demolishing turrets and mile castles that you have only just built. But HQ feel, and I must say I agree with them, that we need as many troops on the wall as possible, so you'll just have to jolly well get on with it.
Well, that's a bit of a turn-up for the book, isn't it? The efficient old Romans changing their minds. They went on to build 15 or so forts in total. Sorry. This is Housesteads. So what's it got? Well, inside it's got some terrific buildings, or had. That's the main entrance to the fort behind me, the East Gate. And I'm on the main road into the fort, the Via Principia, which led into the Legion's headquarters buildings. These over here were just barrack blocks, but look at the terrific quality of stonework like that. I suppose it's so posh because we're on a sort of ceremonial way that led straight into the most important building. The headquarters building was really quite a grand affair. It started with an outer courtyard with nice columns at the entrance there, through into a sort of inner hall, which was even more impressive. It had a classical colonnade. And at one end of that was a podium, the tribunal, where the commanding officer could address his men. And beyond that, into the Holy of Holies, another small strong room cum chapel, protected by rather posh carved stone screens, into a room that held the regimental standard and cash box.
Elsewhere, the buildings include a hospital and granaries. The commanding officer had an extremely large house, almost as impressive as the lavatories. Now, they had wooden seats suspended over pits, which were flushed out by water collected in big stone tanks and led through the toilets in stone channels.
And outside, you can tell even now when they've been largely robbed away, there were extremely impressive defences. It had high, thick walls with turrets at each of the corners. There were 4 gateways, each with a double arch. This is the base of the pillar that divided it into 2. You can see the worn stones eroded by the wheels of the carts coming in and out. 4 feet 8 inches wide, incidentally, exactly the same width as a modern cart wheel, and only ½ an inch less than modern train gauges. It was guarded on both sides by towers. It really must have looked impressive. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to envisage it as it really was? Good grief.
This replica was built at the fort of Arbeer in South Shields in 1986, using the foundations of the original West Gate. That's what the gateways would have looked like when they were new. And the wall too. There's no clear proof that the original wall had a parapet and a walkway along the top, like this replica has, but it seems likely that since they built it so wide, they meant it to be used by soldiers for fighting from and walking along. It's interesting that they should suddenly decide to build these forts on the wall itself, as if they'd suddenly realised that they needed lots of troops there to defend it better from attack, or to use it as a launching pad for their own attacks. It does suggest that they were worried about what was going on further north.
Oh, well, now they've decided that behind the wall, on the south side, on our side, we've got to dig another ditch. I think we ought to call it the vallum. I think you better make that 12 feet deep as well. Oh. This is the vallum. It was 73 miles long and originally 12 feet deep, though it's been filled in again for safety reasons. And it could only be crossed at special causeways opposite the gate of forts, like this one at Benwell on the outskirts of Newcastle. The fort's now underneath that housing estate. And the causeway, which has got a nice bit of Roman road on it, was protected by an arch, a gateway. I'm getting a bit embarrassed about mentioning this, but I think you ought to notice the quality of this stonework, because the archway was made of well-cut stone with an elegantly chamfered plinth.
For 2,000 years, the vallum has remained visible in places between Newcastle and Carlisle. This is where the modern military road dips down and cuts through the vallum near Housesteads.
Now at this point on the wall itself has disappeared. It was replaced by a road in the 1700s. But here, the whole sequence can be clearly seen. I've just climbed rather painfully out of the vallum, over the embankment or berm on the north lip of it, and I'm going to cross where the wall was. Now a road, of course, so look left and look right, across where the wall was, and on into the ditch on the north side.
Isn't it strange? It seemed easy to understand the original wall and ditch, that it was built purely and simply to keep the more northerly tribesmen out.
But the problem with this place is that it's just as well defended to the rear as it is to the front. It's as if they were just as much concerned to keep those on the inside of the wall under control as those on the outside. Do you know what it's like? It's like the Berlin Wall. It's like a cleared military area designed to keep those on the outside out and those on the inside in. I think they'd been having trouble with the natives on both sides of the wall.
Aye, you might be right there, like, because we were pretty tough in my day, back in the time of the Romans, like. You had to be a bit of a hard knock to live up here in them days. You see, we were a tribe called the Brigantes, and we were organised differently from tribes further south, the sort of tribes that the Romans were used to. We were less settled, more likely to fight among ourselves. Oh my goodness, here's one of the neighbours attacking us now, eh? Hey, it happens all the time, man, but you needn't worry, because you'll never make it. That's why the Brigantes built these forts at the top of hills, so that if the attackers were fit enough to get to the top, they still had to get through all of these ditches. Why, you're not seeing them at their best now, like, because they've slumped a bit. They used to be deeper and much steeper, and they were lined with stone, like, and we'd put maybe sharp sticks or thorns in them and all to make them harder. There are 3 of these ditches here at Hulne. It's what we call a multi-vallate fort. Vallate, you know, it's from the Roman, you know, from the Latin. Vallum, a ditch. So this is a multi-ditch fort. Knocks them every time, man. But you know, us Brigantes, why, maybe we fought among ourselves a bit. But the Romans, why, they divided us in 2. There were Brigantes to the south of that wall that they were building, as well as to the north. Hey, we never liked that, you know. And another thing, they just moved us out of the way. My auntie, she had a house down there where they were building that wall. They just hired it out.
They did. Near the wall, there's the ruins of a group of Brigantian houses that seem to have been abandoned when the wall was built. They were between the wall and the vallum, so they were just cleared out of the way. Troublesome locals, then, and an empire just beginning to get tired of expanding. Add to that the fact that the Roman army had had problems of loyalty and discipline in the years before Hadrian became emperor, and a massive undertaking like this must have been a pretty clever way of keeping troops busy. The wall was built for lots of reasons, but put them all together and you've got something quite extraordinary.
Do you know, it was probably even whitewashed, or at least rendered with a thickish layer of white lime render like this bit that survives at Corstopitum. It must have looked so gigantic, so alien. An archaeologist friend of mine described it as being as alien as a motorway would have looked in 19th century Africa. But the bottom line is that it was built as a symbol of power, a statement of authority, an invader's way of oppressing the natives. And that's a use that castles were going to be put to again in future centuries.
Take Norham, for example. It was already old when that Marmion arrived that I was telling you about at the beginning of the programme. It had been built by the Normans in wood originally, but it was rebuilt in stone by a Norman bishop called Le Puiset in about the year 1157.
The most impressive part of it is this gigantic keep in the centre. It's gigantic in a couple of ways. First of all, and what you'd expect, it's gigantic in strength, from the steep banks outside to the massive vaults underneath to the extraordinary thickness of walls. The strength is terrific, but it's gigantic in power too. The scale is huge.
This room on the first floor was a great hall. It had a fireplace, which was a great rarity in the 12th century, and there are fine round-arched Romanesque windows. Romanesque is the posh word for what we used to call Norman. And up here at the east end is a splendid arched niche. The bishop would have sat in front of here to eat, framed magnificently, a figure of tremendous power. But why did he build it? I think questions need to be asked. Bishop Le Puiset, why did you build it?
The Scots. The Scots? Oui. That King David is claiming large parts of our country, eh? He already has Carlisle and now he wants more. I built this chateau in order to protect the borders. I'm interested, Bishop, that you should say our country. Is it in fact any more your country than it is the Scots? Oui, I am a Frenchman, a Norman, an invader. I do not deny it, but it is my country now. I have to impose my, my authority on it. So in fact, you Normans built these castles as much to control the locals as to protect them from outside attack. C'est vrai. We have had some trouble with the natives who have not been entirely happy with our arrival.
The Normans, like the Romans 1,000 years before them, were invaders, aliens. They came, they saw, and they conquered. And they built castles for reasons that were neither pure nor simple. They built castles as the instruments of subjection. They were the bases from which the local population was controlled. And the moment you realise that, it makes sense of what they look like. Massive, powerful, dominant, symbols of oppression.
I'll be with you in a minute. Right, what I thought we'd do today is go out and have a look at how our ancestors had to live in castles in order to protect themselves against attack. I'm dead glad it's not like that nowadays. Forgot my car keys.
Castles, then. Durham Castle was the home of the bishops of Durham, who came here just after the Norman conquest, and over the centuries provided themselves with a superb house. It had a great stone keep, which has been rebuilt, a huge great hall, well-appointed kitchens.
But enough survives of the castle built by those early Norman bishops. These, for example, are the flat buttresses that strengthened the walls of their great hall to show that once the north had been properly conquered, there was enough power, enough security, and above all, enough money to live in a really big way. And nothing shows that more clearly than this original doorway into the Great Hall. It's built by Bishop de Puisay in the mid-1100s. This is sumptuous, isn't it? You would describe it as having 3 orders of columns with enriched scalloped capitals and a bewildering array of geometric decorations in the arch. Domestic Norman architecture just doesn't come any posher than this, anywhere.
And here's another castle, Aydon Castle near Corbridge, built about 100 years later in the middle of the 1200s. And for its time, it must have been really comfy. Not so much a castle as a manor house. It's got nice big 13th century windows. It's got a chimney, one of the oldest surviving chimneys in Britain. This flight of broad steps led up to a great hall on the first floor. At one end of the Great Hall there was a solar wing, a private apartment for the Lord and his family. And that has a fine carved fireplace and is well lit by large windows. The point about all this is that it's more concerned with being livable in than with defence. It feels like a house more than a castle. Until you step back and see the massive defensive walls that were added to strengthen it about 30 years later.
What went wrong? I'll tell you what went wrong. War went wrong. A little girl called Margaret died in the year 1290. She was known as the Maid of Norway, and she was drowned, leaving the succession to the throne of Scotland wide open. The King of England, Edward I, tried to put his own puppet king onto the throne. And that led to more than 300 years of almost continuous warfare between the Scots and the English, which left this northern landscape scarred with poverty and suffering, stricken and rich in nothing but the most remarkable collection of castles to be found anywhere in England. Right, sir. This is Prudhoe Castle. But before I show you around, I wonder if you'd mind me asking you, what is it that you've got in mind for a castle? What are your priorities? Security, good strong defensive features. Oh, you are so right, sir. In these troubled times, there's nothing more important than peace of mind. And I think you'll find that here at Prudhoe Castle, we can offer you that, sir. First of all, sir, the site itself. Now, that's excellently chosen for defence. Good steep banks on 3 sides. And where the ground isn't steep enough, a moat. Right, sir, the castle itself. Now, what's that got in the way of security devices? Well, there's the keep, of course. Mind your head. A little old-fashioned now, of course, but I still think that there's something nice about a bit of height so that you can see who's coming, and massively thick walls. Well, they are a comfort, aren't they, sir? Notice the well-defended inner gatehouse, sir, which means that even if they do manage to break in, there are still plenty of problems for them to overcome. And when you see the outer gatehouse...
Oh, and when you do see the outer gatehouse, you'll realise how seriously security was taken.
It starts on the inside with the original Norman gatehouse, which is quite outstandingly picturesque. That's a typical round Norman arch. Now, this gatehouse must have seemed defence enough when it was built in the 12th century. But even 100 years later, when the Scottish War started, it didn't seem quite sufficient. So they built an extension, a barbican in front of the gatehouse, to make the approach to the front door even more difficult. There were platforms on the walls so that defenders could hoist stuff down at any attackers. And then 30 or 40 years later, they decided that even that wasn't enough, and they built yet another extension. And finally, they decided that they had to go one stage further and build an outer gatehouse. It's just like nowadays. You get a new sort of lock and the creeps learn to break it. You strengthen the front door and they come in through the back. You can't be too careful. You never could. What do you want? Well, I'm interested in what's inside, what all of these defences were protecting. What was it like to live in a castle like Warkworth? Well, to be honest, it's a little bit empty most of the time, because with them being the Percy family, the Earls of Northumbrian, you know, they've got that many houses. They travel around between them most of the time, and wherever they go, they take the furnishings with them. So, to be absolutely honest, it's a bit bare when they're not here. I suppose it's quite canny, you know, when they're here, really, because it suddenly becomes, oh, I don't know, how shall I put it? It becomes the administrative centre, the headquarters for the whole estate. And it becomes a barracks, of course. And, oh yes, it becomes a hotel because we got that many people popping in. It's really busy. And then, most of all, of course, it becomes alive. It becomes a court. It becomes a palace. It becomes full of colour and ritual.
Toast, my lord and his lady.
My lord and his lady.
Now, this was the entrance to the Great Hall, and that rather splendid beast up there was the Percy Lion. Now, virtually all medieval great houses had the same basic accommodation, and that included, first and foremost, the Great Hall itself. The Great Hall here even had an aisle. Those are the bases of its piers down there. And then, at the bottom end, the lower end of the hall, there were almost always 3 doorways. 1, 2, and 3.
One of them led to the buttery, where the beer and the wine butts or barrels were kept. The second one always led into the kitchen. The third led into the pantry, where the pain, the bread, was stored. Although they're no longer standing at Warkworth, you can still see the arrangement at other castles. At Bamburgh, the 3 doors survive in their original form. At Durham Castle, the arrangement was altered slightly when the kitchens, which are still in use today, were altered in the 15th century. The other end of the hall was the dais end, the posh bit, where the lords sat and ate in extraordinary ceremony. A lot like high table at Oxford colleges, which have retained the medieval ritual until today. The lord sat under a canopy and was served by hordes of gents, a carver, a cupbearer, a server, a ewer who held his finger bowl. The posh end was usually marked by some extra architectural splendour, a tower or a specially grand bay window, like here at the rebuilt Bamburgh Castle. And behind the posh end, the private rooms of the lord and his family, the solar and the great chamber. Increasingly, as the Middle Ages progressed, the lord used these rooms more and more and abandoned the hall to his followers and for special feasts.
Feasts? Oh, don't mention feasts to me. Oh, why? Were they, was there something wrong with them? Massive, man. Massive. Do you know, I heard of one that was given by the Nevilles at Raby Castle, the Earls of Westmoreland. It was at their other place at Cawood near York in 1465. Do you know what they had to cook? Do you know what they had to cook for that? 113 oxen, 6 wild bulls, 1,000 sheep, 2,000 chickens, 2,000 geese, 2,000 pigs, 12 porpoises, and 4,000 pasties. Venison pasties. Mind you, that was tea for 2,500 people. Good gracious. And what about here? How many people normally lived here?
Right.
5th Earl of Northumberland, year of our Lord, 1520, 166. Now, that was everybody, mind you. That was him and the family, and his gentlemen and his yeomen and his grooms, and the scullions of the kitchen, 166.
But the crowning glory of Warkworth Castle was the keep. It was built by the first Earl in 1380, and it is one superb piece of architecture, towering above the town and the rest of the castle. Beauty and defence perfectly amalgamated.
It's just as exciting inside, with the usual great hall, the usual 3 doors at the lower end, 1, 2 and 3, to the buttery, the pantry and to the kitchen, which has got gigantic fireplaces inside. Around the great hall there's the solar, of course, and there's a chapel. It's even got a minstrel's gallery. The problem is that all of the accommodation in it already existed elsewhere in the castle. So that Warkworth's got 2 great halls, 2 kitchens, 2 of everything. It's a house within a house. So what was it used for? Why was it built?
Oh, I don't know, really. It looks good, of course, which is important to your great lords. It acts as a second line of defence, and you sometimes need that. Sometimes it's used for visiting big knobs. There is no one single use. It's a bit of a puzzle, really. So on the whole, do you like it here? Do you have any complaints about life in castles?
Women? Women? Or the lack of them. It's all right for him, he's got his wife here, but the rest of us... There's 166 people in this castle, but there's 9 women. 9! It's a hard life.
Well, if you don't want a full-scale castle, so what about a tower, like here at Langley? Now, we've got literally hundreds of these towers on our books, all over these northern counties. It really is one of the most characteristic building types that you can find up here. And we've got them at all different sizes as well, sir, to suit most pockets. From the gigantic, like Langley. You can create a wonderful impression with that, sir. I always think that there's something particularly romantic about a tower, don't you? That height, those battlements. No? Well, perhaps something a little more manageable, sir. This is one of the finest properties on our books. This is Belsay, 14th century tower. It's got some quite remarkable security features. I'm sure you've noticed those rounded corner turrets, or bartizans, to give them the appropriate jargon. And just look at the matriculation on that, sir, eh? The way those battlements are corbelled out from the wall face so that you can... Exactly, sir. Yes, though it doesn't have to be boiling oil. Oh, no. You see, if you've got it, drop it on them. That's my motto, especially if it's loathsome, because your average attacker likes nothing less than something loathsome on the top of his head, eh? Excuse me, sir? Oh, I think you'll find it's surprisingly commodious inside.
On the ground floor, sir, a beautifully appointed kitchen with a state-of-the-art fireplace for the little woman to cook on. And this steeply pointed tunnel vault is an excellent safeguard, sir, against attack or against fire. Now, up the stairs. Now, look at the thickness of that wall, sir, eh? Nearly 9 feet thick. And on the first floor, now we have a number of small rooms. Bedrooms over here, heated with fireplaces and ensuite facilities, with guardrobes. And this is an oratory or chapel. Isn't that interesting, sir? But the main room on the first floor is the Great Hall. Isn't that an impressive fireplace? And there's a couple of very nice windows with delightful little window seats and beautiful views. But the interesting thing about these towers is that though they're first of all castles, they're also medieval houses. They've got all of the things that a medieval house should have. Kitchen, great hall, and on the top floor, a solar for your private use, sir. Only here, they're all scrunched together vertically to make them safer, sir. Sir? Sir? Sir?
These tower houses look romantic as well, and people built them for that reason. But up here on the borders, they were utterly necessary as well. This was a hard country. One of the most famous of all borderers was a member of the Percy family called Harry Hotspur. Now, knights had to win their spurs by some notable deed. Harry won his Hotspurs at the siege of Berwick Castle in 1378. There were only 48 defenders in the castle, but they held out for 8 days before they surrendered, and they were all put to death, slaughtered. So it makes you wonder what young Harry did to earn his spurs. A spot of smiting and putting to the sword, perhaps?
Do you know how old he was? 12. He was 12 years old. He should have been at school. Perhaps it was work experience or national curriculum pillaging. You see, there were hard times.
The army of King David, coming then to the Priory of Lanercost, where dwelt the venerable men, they entered arrogantly into the sanctuary, threw out the vessels of the temple, plundered the treasury, shattered the bones and destroyed as much as they could. What happened at Lanercost in Cumberland in 1297 happened everywhere. For centuries no one on either side of the border could consider himself safe. Monks and nuns built walls around their monasteries and massive towers to afford extra protection, like here at Hulne Priory near Alnwick. Often even the churches themselves were defended. Holy Island Priory had gun emplacements in the roof. And if the great abbeys were in need of protection, ordinary people were at least as and probably far more vulnerable. This primitive, almost barbaric vault at Kirknewton near Wooler could have been built at any time between the 14th and the 16th centuries, and it seems to me to be saying there's no way you'll be safe, even in a church. The villagers of Ancroft, just outside Berwick, went one stage further. They took a perfectly nice little Norman church with a fine Norman doorway, and when the war started, they stuck a mighty great tower in the middle of it all. It's tunnel vaulted on the ground floor, just like any castle tower, and it's got a spiral staircase like any castle tower, and it has little deeply splayed defensible windows, just like any castle tower.
But if churches weren't safe, what price towns? Berwick had been a Scottish town for 300 years until it was captured by the English in 1296, and it went on to change hands 13 times. It stayed so vulnerable for so long that 260 years later it was still felt necessary to strengthen its defences.
These walls were built by Queen Elizabeth I, not on her own of course, and they were absolutely state-of-the-art. They were designed to withstand artillery fire.
What you've got here are walls about 6 metres high, pretty thick and completely sheer. But that's not what gives them the strength. Behind the walls there is a huge thickness of earth embankment piled high, which is there to absorb the impact of any cannonballs. And then there are the bastions, huge arrow-shaped fortresses which jutted out from every angle of the walls.
The only way into the bastions was along tunnels through the thickness of the wall, and they led into cannon emplacements, providing flanking fire along all the approaches to the walls. In 1558, when this system was begun, these were the most advanced fortifications in the whole of northern Europe. Berwick was the most strongly fortified place in Britain, and it needed to be. By the middle of the 1500s, you get the impression that people were just used to fighting, that discipline had just broken down. Even when no major armies were marching, these northern hills were crossed and recrossed by bands of desperate men, cattle thieves and small-scale raiders, feuding families. No one seemed safe, and there emerged a new and quite unique form of defensible house to give more ordinary folk somewhere to protect themselves. They used to be called all sorts of things, stone houses, peels, but nowadays they're called
Bastle houses, sir. Bastles. Like castles with a B, from the French word Bastille. And if you can't afford a castle and you don't want a tower, perhaps you'd like something like this, sir. Yes, I realise it isn't really very large, just the 2 rooms, 1 on each floor. In fact, it's less than that, sir, because you're meant to keep the animals on the ground floor, but at least it is secure. Good thick walls and a good strong door. And you'll be living upstairs, so you can pull the ladder up after you, so it'll be nice and secure that way. And the windows are tiny, so nobody can climb in. Yes, take it from me, sir, you'll never get anything more secure than that. Oh, what a salesman, eh? 1 room, thick walls. Hey, they were hard times. So, what's changed 400 years on in these nice, comfy times that we're living now?
Not much. We still build our new houses as defensively as possible. We still build gatehouses. We still bar our windows and lock, double lock, triple lock our doors. We might not have actual sentries on guard, but we have electronic sentries on watch just the same. Our streets have become horribly disfigured by the grey ugliness of shop shutters. I hate these. They make you feel that you're living in a place under siege.
So what's the difference between all of these defences and those of the Middle Ages? Well, there is no difference. Except their houses weren't as cosy as mine, and they didn't have telly to watch.
This week we need your help to solve 2 unusual thefts.
Nothing changes, does
At
it?
11:40 on Saturday, September the 9th, thieves stole...